basically, in this video, we're going to cover 3 of these papers, which do a segmental analysis, which basically take stylometry and the different studies of stylometry and apply them to the Quran and the Hadith. Now, again, the Quran is what Muslims know to be the Word of God that was revealed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, by God himself. We believe them to be the literal words of God. What are the Hadith? These are these collections of the statements of the Prophet himself. So these are spoken by Muhammad himself. Right? So if Muhammad fabricated the Quran, if he made it up, of course we would expect that both have the same style, the same sort of vocabulary, the same language. But if he did not fabricate them, if really God revealed it to him, right, then we would expect the Hadith, which are the statements of Muhammad, and the Quran, which is the book, to have very different styles, different language, different vocabulary, etc., etc., right? So we would expect in our literary analyses to find a discrimination of authorship. And so in this video, we're going to be looking through these different papers, and they're going to be doing lots of studies from different points of view, and analyzing the text of the Quran and analyzing the text of the Hadith, and trying to determine whether they go back to one author or 2 different authors. What is stylometry? It's basically a science where linguistic analyses are done of different works to determine authorship. So it's pretty popular. For example, it's used a lot to determine the authorship of medieval works. For example, people are very interested in whether Shakespeare actually wrote many of the plays that are attributed to him. So stylometry is a lot of times employed. These linguistic analyses are employed to see whether Shakespeare did write many of his plays, or maybe whether a contemporary helped him on some of those plays, and this and that. Sometimes you find medieval works, and you want to know who the author is, and a lot of times stylometry is done to figure out who that author is. It's also a very popular technique with for example, the New Testament, determining the author of the New Testament, sometimes done with Old Testament books as well. So the point is, this is a very widely accepted and known and reputable science, which is done to determine different types of authorship, and see basically if someone wrote a work, if a work can be attributed to the same person, or if a different person wrote it, etc., etc. And I read a literature review on this, so I'm just giving you the general gist about what the science really is all about. I'm not going to go too much into details. So let's begin, right? Let's just dive into it. So for this, the Quran was looked at, and also the Hadith are from the most reliable collection of Hadith called the collection is called Sahih Bukhari, and many of the Hadith were taken from them. These are the authentic statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Of course, there are other authentic statements as well, but Bukhari is the most reliable one that is considered. And so this paper, starting with this paper, is divided into 3 sections. The first section looks at the 2 books in a global form, and 9 experiments are done. So more of it is looked at, the books are looked at from a point of view of like a large part of the text, right? As much all of the text that has been taken, and then the second part is looking at segmental analyses, like taking different segments, and I believe the third part is similar as well. Let me just see if I remember. Yeah, so right, okay, actually in the third part they do different tests to make an atomic authorship attribution, so we'll go through that as well. So just looking at authorship from different tests. So the first section is about looking at the text from a global standpoint. Second section, we break them down into pieces and segments, and the third section again is looking at authorship using different texts. So let's go into these. I'll try and summarize some of these studies that have been done, and then I'll put the links in the description if you want to look at them in more detail. So, the first study was just looking at the size of the books and this and that. So the results are here. The second study is the investigation on word frequency, right? So they start by looking at discriminative words. These words are basically words that are frequently used in one text but rarely employed in the other, right? And what they write here is which could represent a sample word that can be used for discriminating the two texts, right? So it's important to understand that people have different styles of speaking, different vocabulary, and this and that, and certain words which they often use. And even if you're trying to impersonate someone, these rules of stylometry will still apply, because even if you're impersonating someone, you're still going to use that language that you're familiar with and that you unconsciously just use, right? So these tests even work for that, and in this case, they're looking at discriminative words, which often indicate authorship. Certain authors are more inclined to different words. Everyone has certain words which they use more often than others. And in this case, we see that there are many of these words which have a significant difference in frequency. When we look at the most discriminative words, they have a significant difference in frequency between the Quran and the Hadith. So, for example, if we look at the word wa, which means and, we find 10.94 in the Quran versus 8.02 in the Hadith. Now that's a difference of 30%, as they mention here. An average relative difference of about 30%. If we look at the word allazina, we find 1.12 in the Quran versus 0 in the Hadith, right? So that's high in the Quran. That's mean 1.12% of the time allazina is used, but it's never used in the Hadith. We also see most of these are very, very, very different. Like hatta is 0.16 versus 0.68, right? Imagine using this word only around 15% of the time versus about 70% of the time in your speech. Clearly, this is showing different authorship. 0 versus 0.5, 0.5 versus 0, 0.0.44, 0.41 versus 0, right? Even these are significant too. 1.9 versus 1.5, 3.55 versus 3.15. But of course, the more important ones are things like 0.36 versus 0, 0.36 versus 0, 0.46 versus 0.1, 0.35 versus 0, 0 versus 0.34, 0.15. So you can see most of these are very, very, very different. You find some that are closer, like these few, but generally we're finding the trend is they're very, very different, right? So that indicates what? That indicates that there are two authors. Because again, even if you're fabricating a book, even if you're trying to write in a different style, if you're imitating someone's style, and this and that, these types of words, you're just going to use your natural vocabulary unconsciously, and you only have a specific set of tools, your vocabulary and the way you speak, and that's going to come out. That's going to come out even if you're trying to impersonate someone. And we see here that there are certain words that are, very different in terms of frequency, which again shows you or indicates a difference in authorship. The next study is the cost parameter. So basically, cost parameter is looking at the endings. In this case, in this study, they were looking at the endings and basically how similar they are at when we're looking at sentences which follow each other or not. So to understand what this is really about, let's look at this example here. So you can see here that they say never say it is the end, blah blah blah. Okay, so the ending of this word, this sentence is believe, and the next is retrieve, and the next is mind, right? So believe and retrieve have the same ending, ve, right? So they both get a cost value of 2, right? And this gets a cost value of 2 because below believe is retrieve, which is the same one, so it gets a cost value of 2. and retrieve gets a cost value of 2 because above it is believe and it has the same frequency. Whereas when we go to number 4, we see that the ending is nd, and 3's ending is nd as well, and 5's ending is nd as well. So mind this sentence, sentence number 3, below it is nd, so that gets its two of the same, or 2 cost points. Above it, it's something else, so it doesn't get any cost points for that. This sentence, above it is nd, and below it is nd as well, so it gets 4 points. But this sentence, for example, ends with ge. Above it is nd, it's not the same, and below it is ce, so it's not the same, so it just gets a cost value of 1, and the same for sentence 7. So this is how cost values work. If we look at the Quran and the Hadith and the cost values, we see that they're very different, right? So looking at the cost values for some Hadith, we're finding 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1, 0, right? So clearly the author of the Hadith, which is Muhammad, of course, because these are his statements, not really interested in cost values, right? This type of speech. When we look at the Quran, however, look at that. 4, 4, 3, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 1, 2, 4, 3, 2, right? So looking at the cost values for some Hadith statement versus some Quranic statements, we see there's a big, big difference, which again shows 2 different types of authors. Right, so the average cost was 0.46 for the Hadith versus 2.52 for the Quran. Clearly, 2 different authors. Here's another test. So here they were looking at word length frequency. And so basically what that means is, as they explained, the word length is the number of letters composing that word, whereas the word length frequency for a specific length n represents the number of words that compose of n letters. Right, so the word length frequency means how many words of a specific length are present. And so they did this analysis, and you can see there is a difference. So, of course, certain word lengths are more popular. Of course, you're going to get more words that are generally in this range, right? Because most words are composed of a specific amount of letters, right? For example, you're not going to get a lot of words that are composed of like 10 letters or whatever. So, of course, you do have this sort of general trend. So all we want to look at is like the differences. And we see there are significant differences between the word lengths. So you can see 10.95 versus 8.03 for words that are composed of 1 letter, right? Here we have 21.77 versus 17.61, 19.93 versus 23.2, right? This is a little bit similar, but here again we have very different. 11.24 versus 8.77, right? Here, look at this: 2.48 versus 0.97, 0.25 versus 0.14, 0.02 versus 0.01. So the point is they're different, right? They're different. There's some words lengths that are used in the Quran more than in the Hadith, and there are some times where the Hadith is using them more than in the Quran. Now, to understand for you how significant these results are, right? Because again, you might not understand because you have to factor in certain things. So this graph might not give you all the information that or all the context, I should say. Of course, they did statistical tests on this, right? If you're familiar with scientific papers, they have statistical tests. Let's look at this one. So for length 1, which was this one, they did a statistical test, and they found that involving a probability of consistency, p is less than 0.0001. So that's the p-value, which means there's a very, very, very low chance that this happened by chance, right? There's a very, very, very low chance, as you can see in this value right here, that these two have the same author, yet there's such a big difference. For lens 2, 3, and 4, they did the test and they found, again, P is less than 0.00001, right? Which basically, again, means there's almost no chance that it's the same author. So even these ones, even this one, 16.82 versus 17.34, is pretty significant. For 5, 6, 7, 8, they found the value was P is less than 0.0001, which again just means almost no chance, right? Very, very, very little. 9 and 10, they found P is less than 0.001. So according to all these observations, we conclude that the two authors have different styles. Okay, important to understand. Next experiment here. So now we're looking at the character frequencies of the two books. Basically, you know, like think about them like alphabets, right? So Arabic alphabets. You can see significant differences here, right? So of course, again, certain letters are going to make up, you know, words more often than other letters. Like, for example, in English, think about how you don't really find too many words that are made up of the letter Z, right? So, of course, you know, the most common words are going to be certainly more represented sometimes. So everyone is going to be using certain letters at a rate which is similar, just because of the nature of the languages and what letters compose the most common words and this and that. But what's important to look is the relative differences and see if we can find any significant differences between two authors and how often they use certain letters in the words that they use. And you can see here they show the frequency of all the Arabic characters, and there are differences, as you can see, quite significant in the most discriminant. You see also big differences, right? So again, the Quran versus the Hadith. Of course, you're going to have that general pattern because of the fact that certain letters are going to make up the words, certain of the most common words. But what's significant here is how big these differences are in certain of these letters. For example, 7.5 versus like 4. Or what is this, like 5, right? That's like 8 versus 6. So these are significant differences when you take into account that context that I just explained, right? So we can see, for example, that for the first 5 characters, the difference between the utilization frequencies in the two books is appreciable. Right, so they're talking about these 5, so it's appreciable. This observation implies 2 different writing styles for the 2 books. Right, so these results are actually pretty significant. In the 6th experiment, we look for the words that are present in one book and absent for the other. Right, so let's see what the results were. Okay, so the results of this experiment show that 62% of the Bukhari Hadith words are untraceable in the Quran, and 83% of the Quranic words are untraceable in the Bukhari Hadith. Right, so such tokens are called discriminant words, and that's pretty significant when you think about it. So here they have a diagram. So Hadith words present in the Quran are 38%, and then Hadith words absent in the Quran are 62% when they were looking at their samples, or the Hadith that they chose, or I'm sure it's a large sample. And the Quran words present in Hadith are 17% versus the Quran words absent in Hadith 83%, right? So even if you're trying to imitate someone else, you don't get results like this. You think about how significant that is, right? So practically, it is impossible for a same author to write 2 books with related to a similar topic, with a so great difference in the vocabulary. Therefore, we can deduce that the two books should come from two different authors who are characterized by two different vocabularies. So the next experiment was investigating the citation of numbers in the text, so looking at the different numbers and how often different numbers are used. So they saw, for example, that the number 1 was the most common one in the Quran, versus the number 3 was the most common in the Hadith. And let's see if they have a chart for this. Right, so, okay, actually they don't have a chart for this. Or maybe oh no, okay, so this is the chart. Right, so you can see the Quran versus the Hadith. It's a big difference in terms of like how many times the word one is used, the number 1 is used, how many times the number 2 is used, 3 is used, 4 is used, 5 is used, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's a big difference here, right? Big difference between these, right? So of course, you do not expect this from so, you know, or from the same author, I should say, right? You don't expect it from the same author. So let's see what they say about it. In this experiment, the difference regarding the use of numbers between the two books is so different that we can state that the authors should probably be different. So it's so different. The next one was looking at the animal citation-based analyses. So looking at what different animals are mentioned, and they also mention here that the contexts are similar. So the subject matter is similar. So it's not a matter of, one place it's talking about a certain, one book is talking about certain animals more than the other because we have different literary contexts, but rather the contexts are the same. So they mention that in this paper as well, right? So what they found was, so let's just look at some examples here. So the name for general name of camels, cows, and sheep is cited 33 times in the Quran, but in the Hadith only 2 times. Dog is cited 5 times, whereas it's cited 13 times in the Hadith. Sheep is absent in the Quran, but in the Hadith it's 10. Daba, which is animal, is cited 17 times, or actually it's like creature. It's cited 17 times in the Quran, whereas in the Bukhari Hadith only 3 times. Camel is 2 times in the Quran, but 7 times in the Hadith. 10 times in the Quran is calf, but absent in the Hadith. Fish is only 4 times in the Quran, but 8 times in the Hadith. Let's just go to the charts. Right, so here you can see the charts. It's all laid out. So you can see in the frequency in the Quran, for example, the general name for camels, cows, and sheep is 21%, but in the Hadith only 2.1. Dog is 3.2 versus 13. Sheep is 0 versus 10. 11% for animal or creature versus 3.19% in the Hadith. 1.3 versus 7.45. 6.5 versus 0. 2.6 versus 8.54. Clearly, the author of the Quran is more inclined to use certain animals in their examples and explanations and this and that. And the author of the Hadith is interested in usually different animals, even though the contexts are the same. Right, so here you can see the many animals that are absent, that are mentioned in the Quran, but absent in the Hadith. Like so many of these animals, fast snake, lion, bird, etc., mentioned in the Quran, absent in the Hadith. Similarly, there are many of these that are in the Hadith, but completely absent in the Quran. So they note here that the results show that there are different animal name citations in the two books. That is, 2 cases are possible. Either the 2 books could be related to 2 topics that are contextually different, citing a non-textual type of animal consequentially, right? So it's just a difference based on the context, or 2 different writing styles. Prefer for animal appellations and citations. I don't know if I pronounced this word correct, but whatever. I think we all know what that means, right? So the point is, their conclusion is, however, when we read the two books, we notice that the topics are mainly the same. This fact proposes that the second case is the most probable case in this investigation, that there are two different writing styles by two different authors. Okay, so the next one here is special ending biograms, right? So this special investigation is made on 6 ending biograms, which are often used in Arabic. So, looking at the endings of sentences, I think they are. For example, in the sentence, the cat is here, the following syllables, the, he, and ka, right, represent biograms, and also the end, like he, at, and re, right? So, certain different biograms have been chosen from Arabic, these ones. And we find that there is a significant difference in how often these endings are used in the Quran versus in the Hadith, right? So their conclusion is that the Quran uses much more frequently the plural form in its sentences, because these tendencies are in the Quran. These endings are more often used when plural form is being used. So the author of the Quran is more interested in plural form. Now, the authors of the two books appear to have different styles of writing. In the Quran, the plural form is more employed than in the Hadith. With that, we move on to the second part of this paper, in which we're having segmental analyses. And this is done a lot in stylometry, because you want to have segments of the same length and this and that. In this case, 4 different segments of text are extracted from every book, meaning the Quran and the Hadith, and the different texts are analyzed and compared. Right, so then they mention many different types of tests that are done. We'll just move on to the experiments. Point is, we have 4 different segments of each text. So we have Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. So those are 4 different texts from the Quran, and then we have H1, H2, H3, H4. So those are the 4 different texts of the Hadith. In terms of the Quran, and by the way, these segments again are of similar length. So they're from the beginning of the book, another from the end, and then 2 from the middle. And the segment size is about 10 standard pages, and all the segments are distinct and separated without intersection. Okay? So let's start with discriminative words, right? So words that are most commonly used in a certain in one book, but not in another. So in this case, they saw that the words al-lazina, which means those, and the word al-ard, which means earth, are very commonly used in the 4 Quran segments, whereas in the Hadith segments, these words are rarely used. As for al-lazina, okay, so we can see the results here. So some discriminative words and their frequencies. So in the Quran, you can see al-lazina is in the first segment 1.35, 1.02, 1.12, 0.75, right? So very similar. Al-ard 0.35, 0.63, 0.59, 0.42. But in the Hadith, very different story. So al-ard is used 0.23, 0.13, 0.18, 0.15. Al-lazina 0.11, 0.03, 0.02, 0.08. So you have these similar ranges amongst the Hadith, and very similar ranges amongst the Quran, but you can also tell they do not match. They do not match each other. These go together, and this group goes together, but they do not go together on their own. Right, so the results show that the author of the Quran uses much more frequently these particular words than the Hadith author does. Right, so the next one is the word length frequency based analysis. So the results are here. We'll look at that in a second. But basically, we're looking at in figure 9, the different lengths, or the different curves representing the word length frequency versus the word length. So here's the word length frequency, right, versus word length. Word length meaning how long is a word length frequency, how often that is used. So in this case would be how often a certain word with a specific word length is used. Okay, and we show, and basically their analysis is that we see two important points. Number one, that the hadith curves have more or less a Gaussian shape that is pretty smooth, whereas the Quran curve seems to be less Gaussian and presents some oscillations. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this word properly, but the point is, they're looking here and they're seeing, again, some of this is going to be naturally in the same patterns, but because of how, just what types of letters generally construct popular words, of course. But we do see something interesting in that there is, in the hadith ones are, similar here. They're grouped together, and the Quran ones seem to be grouped together as well. Not only that, but we see, for example, the Quran ones have these different shapes. That's what they were pointing out. These different shapes, and the hadith you just get smooth curves, right? So in the hadith, when you follow this, you get smooth curves. In the Quran, you get oscillations like this. It's an interesting thing to see. The hadith curves are easily distinguishable from the Quran ones, particularly for the lengths 1, 3, 4, and 8. For the lengths 1 and 8, the Quran poses higher frequencies, whereas for the length 3 and 4, hadith pose higher frequencies. So 1, for example, you can see in 1, there is a very significant difference between how often it is used in the Quran versus the hadith. In 8, you see a significant difference as well, right? So like, look at this. We got like, what is this like? I don't even know what this would be like. 7.5 versus almost 10. Here we'd have like, I don't even know how low that would be. 0. Or I guess that's like almost 1 versus, we're seeing when we tally these up, there would be like 2.5 or whatever. When you tally these up, there'd actually be like here, like 7.7 or whatever. And if you tally these up, they seem to be like here. It's like 11. And then if we go to 3 and 4, big differences, right? 3 is here versus all the way here. 4 is here versus all the way here. Point is very different. Now, how different are these? Of course, again, you have to keep in mind the context of, certain letters or certain word lengths. I said letters before, but I meant word lengths are going to be more popular. For example, right? Obviously, you're not going to have too many words that are made up of one letter or 2 letter or whatever, and you're going to have similarly less words that are made up of 7 letter and 8 letter. So this general curve that you're seeing is going to be present everywhere in everyone's speech, right? Because that's just the nature of how the words are made, right? Most words have 3, 4, 5 letters, right? And they go up, and then there's like the sweet spot, and then you have very few letters or in the words as you move on, right? So it's important to keep that context in mind. And when they do statistical tests, we see that using the frequency of monograms, trigrams, and tetragrams or octograms, which means 1-letter word, 2-letter or 1-letter word, 3-letter word, 4-letter word, and 8-letter word, the probability that they came from the same author is only 2.86%. Right, so although these results cannot be used accurately in authorship discrimination, they can give preliminary information on the size or the sizes of the preferred words by each author. That is, according to these results, we should expect that the true text group corresponding to different authors. So next up, they did the cost parameter test. If you remember what the cost parameter is, we already covered it in the first section. It was like, the endings that are the same, right? So like if believe and then retrieve both end with VE, these types of things. Friend and what the other one was like, I don't know. What rhymes with friend? I don't know. Maybe it was like a hand would have the same ending as friend. So hand and friend would count as well because of the ending. That's what was meant by cost parameter. So they did these to the to find the average cost in the Quran versus the Hadith. And the results are in table 7. So you can see in the first segment of the Quran, the average cost was 2.2 versus 2.6 versus 2.6 versus 2.38. Hadith, they were 0.46 versus 0.47 versus 0.43 versus 0.47. It's interesting too see that. Clearly, the Quran goes together and the Hadith go in a different category. So then they looked at the next test, which is going to be the use of some characters that are very commonly used in only one of the books. In this case, it was va, or the letter va. Or anyway, the point is this is a letter in Arabic. It's also a word. It means and it's used as a vowel and a consonant. And basically, they're looking at how often it's used in either or in each book. And what they see is this letter, which is very significant because again it's a vowel consonant and it means the word and. 7.7, 7.1, 6.9, 7.04. This is the frequency of how much it's used in the Quran segments, whereas the Hadith segments 5.1, 5.4, 4.7, 5.3. So you can clearly see, what's going on here. So this difference in the character frequency shows that the two authors do not employ the character va or vowel. It's vowel. I just remember it's vowel in the same proportion. So yeah, I was blanking on that, but you can clearly see the Quran goes together, the Hadith go together, and they do not go together. Both groups do not go together. Clearly, we have two different authors and two different styles. Okay, so the next set of experiments, or the next experiment, they were looking at the similarity between the vocabularies of the two books. So they used the measure that they called VSM, which is basically the number of common words between the two texts divided by the size of text 1 times the size of text 2 all over square to 0.5. Just typical complicated stuff. Point is, typically in case of two identical texts, this similarity measure will have a value of 1, i.e. 100%. Hence, the higher this measure is, the more similar the two texts are. we recall that there are 4 texts of the Quran and 4 texts of the Hadith that are more or less comparable in size. We notice that all the diagonal elements equal to 100%. We do remark also that all the QQ similarities and HH similarities are high relative to QH and or HQ ones. This means that the 4 segments of the Quran have a great similarity in vocabulary, and the 4 segments of the Hadith have a great similarity in vocabulary too. On the other hand, it implies a low similarity between the vocabulary styles of the two different books, right? And so, if you look at the results here, they're in Table 9. Let's see if they mention it. Just want to make sure. Anyway. You can see the Quran, here we go. So Q1 matches up 100% with Q1. Okay, and it matches up. Q1 matches up with Q2, Q3, and Q4, very similar amounts. Q2 matches up 100% with Q2. And with Q1, Q3, and Q4 matches up similar amounts. Same thing here and same thing here, right? With Q3 and Q4, the matching is very similar. When we compare Q1 to Hadith, however, we find there is a little bit of a different ratio. When you look at it with Q2, again, there's a little bit of a different ratio, or a quite significantly different ratio. Q3, pretty significantly different as well. Q4, again, very significantly different. When we look at H1, we find these around 30%, whereas for the Quran, it's around 20%. For Hadith 2, again, around 30% versus 20%. 30% versus 20%. Around 30% versus 20%. So you can clearly see this, sort of thing happening here. Here it was like 20% versus 30%. 20% versus 30%, 20% versus 30%, 20. So everywhere it's, or this place is 20 versus like 26 or 25 or whatever. Right. So mean VSM similarity in percentage between one segment and the different segments of one book. So H1 was on 30 versus 20, 30 versus 20, 30 versus 20, 30 versus 20, 20 versus 27, 19 versus 30, 18 versus 30, 19 versus 25. So you can see these are being grouped together and these are being grouped together. When you see the results, you see this clear group, right? And if Muhammad was coming up with all of it, we would not expect these clear groupings and clearly showing different authorships. So what do they say? Similarly, we remark that the intrasimilarities within a same book are high, between 26 and 31, and the intersimilarities, meaning between the two different books, are relatively low, not exceeding 20%. So this observation shows that all these segments of the same book appear to have a unique origin, and that the two books should have two different author styles. So the next set of experiments, here we are in section 3. So here they were looking at automatic authorship attribution. So it's just a bunch of complex tests that are used a lot in stylometry. And they chose 4 segments. So they're similar in size to one another again, right? And 2 experiments were done. In the first experiment, the first segment of each book is taken as a reference. Hence, there will be 2 reference texts, one representing the Quran author and the other representing the Hadith author. The 6 remaining texts, 3 for each book, have to be classified into Quran class or Hadith class. And the second experiment is the same, but just the second segment is taken for reference. So again, what they did was they got 4 segments from the Quran and 4 segments from the Hadith. Okay, then they used in the first experiment, they would use the first segment of the Quran and the first segment of the Hadith and use it as a reference. Then they would look at the other 3 Quranic segments and the other 3 Hadith segments and try and see if they belong to the which group they belong to, the Quranic group, right, which was the first reference, the Q1 reference, or the Hadith group, which was the H1 reference. And then they would, in the second experiment, the same thing is done, but just with these, whereas the second segment now is taken as a reference, and Q1, Q3, and Q4, and H1, H3, and H4 are trying to be looked at and seen if they are written by one of the 2 authors and which group they go into. Right, so I'll try and explain it once more. Basically, you got Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, right? So you would take Q1 and you would use it as a reference. Then you would apply, many different tests to it. And then you would look at Q2, Q3, Q4 and see, does it match up with Q1? Is it the same author, right? And then you would look at H2, H3, and H4 and see, does it belong to the author who wrote Q1? Similarly, you would be taking H1 as a reference. And then you would see, do H2, H3, and H4 belong to H1? Right? And similarly, you would look, do Q2, Q3, Q4 belong to H1? Right? So this is what's going on. Again, you can just read, you can pause the video and read this if you don't understand. Point is, when we look at the results, we're seeing that all of them go into each classification perfectly, which means the Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 clearly match up in vocabulary and all these different statistical tests that are different statistical tests that were being described here. Right? You can take a pause and read all these different ones that are done here. So all the Q fragments line up perfectly with each other. Almost all of them are 100%. And all the H fragments line up perfectly with one another, which means what? That the Q fragments, all of them, are from the same author. And the H fragments, all of them, are from the same author, but they are from 2 different authors. So all the Q ones went perfectly into the Q group. All the Quranic segments were perfectly matched up with the Quranic reference segment. And all the Hadith references, they did not match up with the Quranic ones, but they matched up perfectly with the Hadith group. Okay? So let's just read this. So, by the way, here they were looking at, there are two different sets, right? So in the first set, they're looking at all the different features, and in the second set, they're looking at the same stuff, but with just the 50 most frequently used, features in that segment. So, in this experiment, all the text segments have to be classified into two classes: the Quran class or Hadith class, right? And again, the point is they are perfectly classified. So their conclusion is clearly that the four Quranic segments should belong to a same author, and the four Hadith segments should belong to the same author too, and that these two authors are likely to be different. In the second experiment, they did the same thing, but again, number 2 was used as a reference. So the second segment was used as a reference for each. And again, it's perfectly done. 100% means a perfect score, perfectly matches up. So clearly, they all have the two sets, the Quran and the Hadith, are by two different authors, but each individually, the Quran individually is written by the same author, and the Hadith individually is written by the same author. So the Hadith is by Muhammad, and these tests show that as well. They have the same author, but the Quran clearly is not by Muhammad, it's by a different author. Right? Because the Hadith, in this set, we're seeing that the Hadith perfectly match up with one another, but the Quran does not perfectly match up with the Hadith. Rather, it matches up with the Quran, the different Quranic segments. So again, different tests were done: bigram, tetragram, trigram, legomena, whatever that is. Let's just look at some of the tests that they employed here. So, using several features, words, word engrams, characters, character engrams, and legomena, several classifiers, Canberra, distance, cosine distance, blah 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 blah. You can read about that if you want, but whatever. So again, their conclusion is two different authors, right? First, the two investigated books should have different authors. Second, all the segments that are extracted from a unique book appear to have a certain stylistic similarity. On to the next paper. In this paper, they were just looking at the leave-out classification. So this is another type of test that is done to determine authorship. Okay, so in this case, they had 37 different segments, 29 from the Quran and 14 or 8 from the Hadith, I think. Point is, they did 37 different experiments using the leave-out method. What is the leave-out method? You basically get a sample, right? So here you have 5 samples, so they're showing you an example, right? And then 4 of them you classify together, and then another one you leave out, right? And so you're going to do your literary analysis and tests on these 4 samples right here, and then you're going to do the test and see if this sample that has been left out, that you didn't do any tests on, whether this matches up with the these the style of these samples, or if it's different. So this was done, right? So again, they would then do it with the different samples. So then they would change a sample, right? So in the first one, this one was left out. In the second experiment, they would look at these ones together, and they would leave this one out. Then they would look at these ones together, and they would leave this one out. So they would do the test, find out the style of this, and see if this matches in this style or not. If it's by the same author or not. If this one is by the same author as the author of these, or if it's a different author. So that's just an overview, basically, of what's going on, right? So in this case, they had 29 different text segments for the Quran and 8 different text segments from the Hadith. And you can see they're pretty much of the same tokens, which means the amount of words that are used pretty much the same. And you can see all the Quranic segments are 100% perfectly passing the test. All of them belong to the same Quranic segments. The Hadith ones are perfectly belonging to each other. So the Hadith ones belong to the Hadith, and the Quran ones belong to the Quran, and they all perfectly match up 100%. Okay, so we recall that there are 37 text fragments where 29 segments are taken from the Quran and 8 are from the Hadith. We use the feature character tetragram by keeping only the 500 most frequent features, and the employed classifier is the SMO based SVM. Since there are 37 samples, we will also have 37 experiments of rotating classification, where in every experiment one sample is removed and put in testing set in order to be identified through the remaining samples that represent the training model. Okay? In the following table, we represent the scores of good classification corresponding to our 37 cross-validation experiments. So each perfectly groups into the one, into each one of the groups, right? So discussion. Let's look at that. So they found that there was discriminative authorship. We could see in the results section the accuracy of every cross-validation step. I.e. for all the 37 LOO experiments, meaning leave out one experiment, was 100%, leading to an average cross-validation score of 100% too. From these results, one can conclude the following. First, the two books, Quran and Hadith, pose two different author styles. Two, the segments of every book are quite similar in terms of style within a single book. And three, the cross-validation technique shows that this result is quite significant since the same score has been obtained 37 times during the test of cross-validation and with different configurations. So they have different styles and probably different authors as well, they mentioned here. Right? They should probably come from different authors, of course. Especially when you keep the nature of how people speak and the last study in mind. Right, so even with this test, and you saw it's a pretty interesting test, right? So they look at all the samples, then they leave one out and see if it matches. But they did that, and the hadith were perfectly classified with the hadith, and the Quran perfectly with the Quran, and they did all of them together, and right, so that's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting. That's it for the last paper. Let's just move on to the third paper. In this paper, some of the similar experiments to part 1 were performed sometimes, and what was different mostly was that a larger sample size was used. A much larger sample size for the hadith was used, because it was thought that it'd be better for this experiment to use a much larger sample size of hadith. Also in the study, you can see they have 11 hadith segments, and then they have 14 Quranic segments, and they're all about the same number of words or tokens. So the first thing is the word structure of the different segments, right? So in order to see the overall structure, okay, so basically when we look at these results, we see that, again, just like the last one, word lengths versus word frequency, right? So it's the same table. One, there's a significant difference between how many times words of length 1, which means one letter, are used, versus in the Quran versus the Hadith. Similar with 3 and 4, and then also similar with 8. And they mention, some of these results are significant, right? So it shows that the words have more or less the same dimension frequency for both books, except for unigrams, trigrams, tetragrams, and octograms, right? So last time 1, 3, 4, and 8 were mentioned, and again they're mentioned here. So there's a big difference between how many word lengths, or how many words with the words that are composed of 8 letters are used, as well as 1 letter, 3 letter, and 4 letters in the different books. And we saw last time there was a big statistical difference there as well, right? So that was interesting, and we see the same results being replicated here. Even the what do you call them? Oscillations, or oscillations, or I'm pretty sure they're oscillations. You see this graph is moving like this, up and down, whereas in the hadith you got smooth curves, right? Next up we got herein we will. So then basically that was just an overall look. Now they're going to describe the 4 series of experiments that were conducted. So the first one here is, in order to represent the stylistic similitude between the different texts in a graphical way, a, a hierarchical clustering using blah 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 has been performed on all text by using the following features. Cost parameter, if you remember what cost is, it's like the same two letters at the end in this case. And in the beginning as well, I think they were mentioning two letters in the beginning, but I think they were just looking at for the end for this one. And the frequency of the word alladina, meaning those. The resulting dendrogram is displayed in Figure 2, where we see the different possible clusters and their costs. The smaller the cost is, the more similar the segments are. So you can see the H segments group together perfectly, and the Quran segments group together as well. As we can see in Figure 2, the segments have been automatically divided into two main clusters, the cluster Q and the cluster H. Right, so the last cluster, this one here, it's too far apart. This is what they're mentioning, right? It doesn't count because the corresponding distance of this last cluster is more than 4.5, which is relatively very large. And secondly, this one doesn't count because we do not retrieve any link between heterogeneous segments at all. Point is, the results show that the different text segments should belong to two different authors, at least two different author styles. It also shows the Quranic texts are relatively similar and the Hadith texts are relatively similar too, right? So when they did the cost test here, or what cost is again, it's the last two words ending the same way, and also in this case they were looking at the frequency of the word allazina, which means those. We found that the Hadith segments clustered together, right? All 11 segments, they group together. The Quran ones naturally group together as well, which shows you what? Different authors, right? And you can see there's no connection between these two as well. That's pretty interesting. So then they basically describe some of these different tests that are done to look at or determine the different styles, right? So this is all just complicated stuff. You can read about it if you want. I'll put the links in the description. But let's just move on to the good stuff, right? Let's just move on to the results, which is what we care about, not all the science, which is just gonna bore you, right? So again, they mention in the results section there are 25 different segments, 14 from the Quran and 11 in the Hadith, right? In these experiments, 3 segments of the Hadith and 3 other segments of the Quran are used for the training, and the remaining segments are used for testing. Therefore, there are 19 different segments to identify according to 2 referential authors. In the following paragraphs, an attribution error of 0% means that all the Quran segments are classified as Quran class and all the Hadith segments are classified as Hadith class. So if there's an error of 0%, that means all of them are perfectly classified into the group. Right, so you can see that when they did the tests that we saw last time around too in the last paper, all of them are perfectly going into each one of the segments. So if you remember last time, there was 100% everywhere. Now it's 0% because last time they were 100% mean 100% accuracy. 0% here means 0% error. The point is, when they looked at, they took 3 reference tests or 3 reference segments for each. And then they tested the remaining 8 for the Hadith and the remaining 11 for the Quran, and they found that these 11 perfectly matched up with these 3 reference ones, and these 8 perfectly matched up with these 3 reference ones from the Hadith, and neither of them matched up with the other. So there was an error of 0% in terms of the matching, right? And again, this is similar to what was done last time too, right? So from this we can deduce the 2 religious books should have 2 different authors. So next up they look at cost. Again, remember cost. What is cost? It's like this. Believe and retrieve, same ending, so cost of 2. Mind, friend, hand. So in terms of friend, ND, 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 ND above, ND below, so cost of 4. ND here, it has 1 ND below, so a cost of 2. Above it is VE, so cost of 2. Chance is change, so they're different, so 1. Hand is different from GE as well, so GE doesn't match anywhere, so it's a cost of 1. And the point, right? So that was the point. And we see when they analyze the hadith, uh, or right. So these are the hadith. You see almost zero for cost, except here 1 1 2 2 1 1 1, right? And then there's a zero in the middle. With the Quran, again, you see a lot of cost values, which shows you again what different authors, right? So again, similar to what was done last time. But this time they also put it in a graph form. So again, we're looking at a paper which is doing some of the similar studies, but with a much larger and different sample size. So it's very interesting to note. You can see here the average cost values for the Quran much greater than the average cost values for the Hadith. Clearly, we're looking at two different authors. Now they did that with the frequency of the word allazina, those, and you can see it's used a lot more in the Quran than in the Hadith. Right, so its average frequency is 0. Let's see here. Its occurrence frequency is about 0.63% and 2.02% for Quran segments, but between 0 and 0.29% for Hadith segments. Its average occurrence frequency is 1.3% for Quran segments and only 0.09% for Hadith segments. Point is, it's used a lot more in the Quran, and again, we're seeing with the larger sample size, the same stuff being shown. So we get a two-tailed p-probability that is less than 0.0001%. So look how low the chance is, right? Based on the probability value. If you just take this probability value, or the test value, the statistical test value, and you see that basically what this means is that there's almost no chance that we have the same author, right? Rather, we have different authors. So just the discussion here. As a continuation of previous research, the present investigation performs segmental analysis for the test of authorship discrimination, right, between the two books, Bukhari Hadith and the Quran. 4 series of experiments were made, right? The first series consisted in an authorship attribution task, which is looking at the different text segments by using several state-of-the-art features and classifiers. Second one, we looked at cost. The third one, we looked at al-lazina, how often that is used, right? And the fourth one was looking at the or what was this? Performs a hierarchical clustering of right. So that was the first one where they were just classifying which of the two segments or which of the two groups they belong to and if they perfectly match up, right? And so that was this one here, if you forgot. This one, right? So 0% error in classifying each of the different segments. So again, their conclusions are the two segmented books should have two different authors, and all the segments that have been extracted from a unique book should probably belong to the same author. Right, so that's very interesting to see here. So that's it for the 3 studies. I do want to mention some comments at the end. One of the things I want to mention is that, this is not something you actually need a literary analysis and all these statistical tests and all this science to figure out. It's actually pretty obvious, and Muslims have known about this, and Muslim scholars have pointed it out for a long time. That when you look at the Quran and the way it speaks, and then you look at the Hadith, it's clearly by two different authors and two completely different styles. And anyone who reads the Hadith and the Quran in Arabic can see this, and similarly, if you even read them in English, you can actually still perceive it in a way. Now, there is something, it's not actually advisable to go ahead and read the books of Hadith because you need a scholar to really explain that stuff, because Hadith were said in a certain literary context and a historical context and this and that. So without that, these Hadith collections weren't actually written for laymen; they were written for scholars. But if you do actually sit down with a scholar, and that's the proper way to learn Hadith, you read the hadith, or you ever listen to some hadith being quoted in lectures and this and that, it's pretty obvious the way this is being spoken and the language that is being used is very different than in the Quran, right? You clearly got two very different pieces of work.
A friend gave me a copy of The Fortress of a Muslim.
Yeah.
You know, the small
Yeah.
book of du'as. Some of them are ayah from the Quran and some of them are hadith.
Yes.
Now we know that both are wahi, right?
Of course.
You know, subhanAllah,
Revelation.
you know, and you know, but of course the Quran has an extra status, right? Definitely, because it's Kitabullah, yeah. And I was saying to my friend, this is different. This one is different from this, like, and he said, yeah, that's the Quran, that's the hadith. And then I'd turn the page, I'd read that, and every time the ayah from the Quran, I just felt that it's different, bro. And I'm reading it in English, bro.
SubhanAllah.
Right? So I got onto one ayah.
You mean the transliteration or the translation?
Translation and the transliteration.
Okay.
It's got the Arabic, the
And
transliteration,
you just felt like it's different.
and the English, right? But
SubhanAllah.
even in the English, bro, I was like, this is different to that, right?
So if Muhammad is not making up this Quran, then the question naturally arises, well, where is he getting it from, right? Because he's got to be getting it from somewhere. He's clearly not making it up himself. And this is a very important question to consider because the Quran claims itself, and the Prophet claims it is from Allah himself. It is from God himself, right? And we've seen today clearly it's not from Muhammad. And also the other thing interesting that these studies prove is that the hadith are going back to the Prophet, peace be upon him. They are his words, right? They're not being made up by different people. Why? Because they clearly have one author. The literary features are very, very similar, right? And so, again, naturally, the question of, well, who is it if it's not Muhammad must arise if you've seen this video. Again, Muslims will post that it is God himself. But there are a few other potential sources. And in this video, I will, go with one point and refute all the other potential sources, one point by one point. Of course, all of these, there could be a lot more detail that, I could go into for each of them. But, that's not the focus of this video. The studies was the focus. But I do want to cover some of the other sources and show you how it could not be them. The first thing, though, I want to mention is that Muhammad was known to be sincere. Right? He is recognized as sincere by the Muslims, and also many non-Muslims have noticed this too. I'll give you one proof of this. So there was a solar eclipse. This is a hadith. This is meaning an event that happened at the time of the Prophet. There was a solar eclipse in the time of Allah's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on the day his son Ibrahim died. The people said, "The eclipse of the sun has happened due to the death of Ibrahim." Allah's Messenger said, "The sun and the moon are two of Allah's signs. They are not eclipsed due to the death or the life of anyone. So when you see them, supplicate to Allah and offer prayers until the eclipse is over." So now, if this was a liar, right? If this was someone who's making stuff up, he would take this opportunity. If he was a false prophet, he would take this opportunity and be like, "Yeah, clearly, my son died. And look, God made the sun and moon do this," right? Because the people were saying the sun and moon are sad over his his son's death, right? So this was a perfect opportunity for him. If he was a liar, if he was a charlatan, he would have taken this opportunity and noticed that the people were saying this about him. So, it wasn't even that he had to make up this claim, but rather people were saying it about him already. But yet he came and corrected them. This is not the behavior of someone who is a liar. Clearly he was sincere, and there are many, many ways in which we can prove this. This is one proof. The other potential source is he was getting it from some Christian or Jewish teachers. This is also proven false in many, many different ways. I'll give you a quick point through which we can prove it. That's the fact that the Quran corrects biblical history many, many, many times. Also corrects many of the contradictions in the Bible. So one example is, for example, in the time of Joseph, the Bible refers to the leader of Egypt as Pharaoh, and it also refers to the leader of Egypt at the time of Moses as Pharaoh. The Quran, on the other hand, refers to the leader of Pharaoh, or leader of Egypt, at the time of Moses as Pharaoh, but at the time of Joseph, it refers to the leader of Egypt as king. Now, interestingly, we found out historically now that at the time of Joseph, there was no pharaoh. The leader of Egypt was called king, not pharaoh. The word pharaoh was not used until at the time of Moses. So the Bible made a mistake, it made an error, and the Quran corrected it, right? And there is no way the Quran could have known this because the knowledge through which this was known was buried and unknown, right? It was only until after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone that hieroglyphics or Egyptian ancient hieroglyphics were decoded. At the time of Muhammad, they were not. They were not known. It was a dead language, right? But only recently, a few or like 100 years ago or something, the hieroglyphics were decoded, and all this knowledge could be available to us. So this was not known at the time of Muhammad. So if he was getting it from some Jews or Christians, he would have repeated the word pharaoh that the Bible used, but instead the Quran corrected it to king, even though there was no way that Muhammad or anyone else at his time could have known this. Right? So how is it that the Quran is correcting the biblical mistakes? And it corrects many contradictions in the Bible as well, and many inconsistencies. I'll give you an example of something that doesn't make sense in the Bible. The idea that there were 2 million children of Israel who went out in the Exodus, that doesn't really make sense because there are only a few generations between Moses and Joseph in the Bible. And so how is it that the children of Israel go from being 12 brothers, Joseph and his 12 brothers, that was the tribe of Israel, and maybe any children they had, and in a few generations, you have 2 million of them. That doesn't make any sense, right? How do you get just a few generations? You have 12 brothers and maybe some of their children, and they turn into 2 million men and women and children. That doesn't make any sense. Not only that, but in the Bible, only 2 midwives are sent to kill the baby boys of the children of Israel that were being born, because the story is that Pharaoh was killing the baby boys once a year of the children of Israel that were born. But that doesn't really make sense, that there were like 600,000 women and only 2 midwives took care of all the new babies that were being born. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. There must have been a lot of pregnant women, and 2 midwives could not have handled that. So there seems to be an inconsistency in the Bible here, but the Quran corrects it and calls the children of Israel at the time of the Exodus of Moses a small group. Right? So clearly the author of the Quran is correcting the Bible from a historical standpoint, and also the inner inconsistencies in it as well. So it doesn't really make sense that Muhammad was learning from a Jewish or Christian teacher, because A, he was sincere, right? As we've shown before. I'll give you one evidence that he was sincere, and B, there's no way he was correcting these historical miracles. Also, some people would say that he learned it from the Arabs. The problem is the Arabs did not know many of these stories, like the biblical stories that are told in the Quran, and we should accept the secular scholars as well will accept the Quranic accounts of what was happening at the time of the Prophet, and as historical accounts about Muhammad and his people, simply due to the fact that Muhammad was reciting these verses unto the Arabs, and they were believing in him. So, if he was reciting stuff that was inaccurate and this and that, people would have not believed in him, right? And he would have been regarded as ridiculous. So, for example, after mentioning some of the stories of the older prophets, I think particularly the story of Noah or something like that, but this is repeated throughout in other places in the Quran as well, this type of dialogue. Allah says, تِلْكَ مِنْ أَنْبَاءِ الْغَيْبِ نُوحِيهَا إِلَيْكَ. That is from the news of the unseen which we reveal to you. مَا كُنْتَ تَعْلَمُهَا أَنْتَ وَلَا قَوْمُكَ مِنْ قَبْلِ هَذَا. You knew it not, neither you nor your people before this. فَاصْبِرْ. So be patient. إِنَّ الْعَاقِبَةَ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. Indeed, the best outcome is for the righteous. Right now, if he was getting it from some Arabs and then reciting this to them, the Arabs would have simply been able to raise their hand. Someone in the back would have been able to raise his hand and been like, I already knew these biblical stories before, and then that would have disproved Islam right there. Because Muhammad would be claiming that these Arabs didn't know these stories, but obviously they would have known them if his source was an Arab. In fact, the Arabs even recognized this, and that's why they accused Muhammad of learning, peace be upon him, from a non-Arab, right? Because obviously these stories were unknown to them, so he must have got them from a foreigner. This was their reasoning. So Allah responded to this in the Quran. وَلَقَدْ نَعْلَمُ أَنَّهُمْ يَقُولُونَ إِنَّمَا يُعَلِّمُهُ بَشَرٌ لسان الذي يلهدون إليه عجمي وهذا لسان عربي مبين. And we certainly know that they say it is only a human being who teaches him. The tongue of the one they refer to is foreign, right? Ajamiyu, foreign. And this Quran is in a clear Arabic. So the Quran even directly refutes this idea that he was getting it from an Arab, and then it also mentions the quotation of the Arabs that he got it from a foreigner, right? They wouldn't be saying this if they knew these stories already, right? Why would they come up with this accusation? Also, some people would say maybe you got it from the devils. Again, Allah responds to this in the Quran. وَمَا تَنَزَّلَتْ بِهِ الشَّيَاطِينَ. And it was not the devils who brought this down. وَمَا يَنْبَغِي لَهُمْ وَمَا يَسْتَطِيعُونَ. And it is not for them to do so, nor can they, right? Can you imagine a pagan society worshipping idols, burying their baby daughters alive and this and that? I mean, it is the most immoral society in the world. Why would Satan raise up a prophet there and turn them into monotheists and make them worship the one God and make them keep commandments of God and this and that are very similar to many of the commandments you find in the Bible? Of course, many of them of course, some of them are different, but overall, but many of them are similar too. So you find, Islam is a lot closer to, of course, Judaism and Christianity than the Arab pagans were. So it doesn't make any sense for Satan to, turn a pagan idolatrous society and this and that into a bunch of monotheists that believe in the God of Abraham, so, and make them believe in all those prophets and all those previous books like the Torah and this and that. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, and nor would the devils ever be capable of producing a Quran like this. And that's the other interesting thing, where that if you watch these lectures, and I'll post these as well, you'll see that the Quran not only does not fit into the style of speech of Muhammad, peace be upon him, but rather it doesn't fit into any Arabic speech. It cannot be classified in any way. It cannot be classified in any form of poetry or anything like that. It's a completely unique, different style of speech that no one has been able to come up with anything that can be classified in the same classification of the Quran. It is a completely unique and different type of speech, right? And this is a challenge in the Quran, actually. أم يقولون افترى قل فأتوا بعشر سورة مثله مفتريات وادعوا من استطعتم من دون الله إن كنتم صادقين. Or do they say he has fabricated it? Say, produce 10 fabricated surahs like it and seek help from whoever you can other than Allah if what you say is true. Surahs basically meaning chapters. It's a bit more of an eloquent thing used to refer to kind of like chapters in the Quran, but the basic meaning here is chapter. Actually, this challenge was even made easier later on. It was said, bring just one chapter like it, one surah like it, and they were unable to, right? Because the Quran is a completely unique speech, a completely different speech. And Allah says, قُلْ لَإِنِ اجْتَمَعَتِ الْإِنسُ وَالْجِنُّ عَلَىٰ أَنْ يَأْتُوا بِمِثْلِ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ لَا يَأْتُونَ بِمِثْلِهِ وَلَوْ كَانَ بَعْضُهُمْ لِبَعْضٍ زَهِيرًا. Say, if mankind and the jinn gathered in order to produce the like of this Quran, they could not produce the like of it, even if they were to each other assistants. Also, for those who claim he was mad or whatever, of course, the simple answer to that is that the Quran is a very logical speech. Even if you don't believe in it, it's a very logical speech. You don't expect such a logical, eloquent speech to come out of a madman, right? The other thing is, if Muhammad was deluded and this and that, peace be upon him, then it doesn't make sense that he was the leader of Arabia and he was the leader initially of a city, Medina, and he was a just leader and a respected leader, and he came with a law, the Quranic laws, which make a lot of sense, and this and that. You wouldn't expect these kinds of laws and this and that to come from a deluded man. You wouldn't expect a deluded, crazy man to be able to run a state and so successfully and come up with these smart military tactics and this and that in war whenever wars were fought and this and that. So it doesn't really make sense that he was mad either.
ألف لام ميم تنزيل الكتاب لا ريب فيه من رب العالمين أم يقولون افتراه بل هو الحق من ربك لتنذر قوما ما أتاهم من نذير من قبلك لعلهم يهتدون